Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Shelby Hayes. I'm the Marketing Director and COO at Evans & Davis, and we've got a great webinar prepared for you this evening. Tonight, we'll be covering the best legal practices for your investment properties. We've got about 30 to 45 minutes of content here on that topic, and then plenty of time for you to be asking questions as well. So send in those questions for us as we go throughout the evening. I'll be here with just a couple of housekeeping tips before we really get started with our attorneys and the topics that they'll be covering tonight. If you've not joined us for one of our webinars yet, welcome, and thank you again for joining us. We cannot see or hear you tonight. So if you're eating dinner or you're driving down the road, whatever you have going on, no worries, we can't see or hear you. But again, we do want to be able to answer your questions. So the best way to send us questions would be through the chat feature. You can click in there and just send us a message anytime throughout the evening. If you have any trouble with that, you can also send us an email and we'll make sure that we're able to get those questions answered for you. So sit back, relax, enjoy. And I want to go ahead and introduce our attorneys that are going to be presenting this evening and answering all of your questions. Landon Long is one of our partners and attorneys at Evans & Davis. He is a University of Oklahoma College of Law graduate, and Landon has worked with so many clients in this rental real estate world that y'all are really going to be chatting tonight and hearing from someone who has extensive experience with clients who have one rental property or hundreds of rental properties. So a lot of wealth of knowledge in this area. And Katie MacKenzie is another one of our attorneys here at Evans & Davis who works side by side with Landon. So she has all of that experience as well, from a simple LLC to one that is working with many properties. So again, they're going to be able to answer a lot of your questions this evening. And let's just go ahead and jump into it. Katie, you want to get us started?
I will. Thank you, Shelby, and thank you everybody for coming. Today we're talking about LLCs, so we're going to kind of go over what is an LLC and how you would set one up. Starting off first, what is an LLC? So an LLC is an entity, but the purpose of an LLC is to separate your personal assets from your business assets. So if somebody were to trip and fall on one of your investment properties, we want to make sure that your personal assets are separate from that investment property. The way that you form an LLC is that you set it up with the state, pull an EIN, and draft an operating agreement, but we'll go over a little bit more about that later. There's a couple of different ways that you can tax an LLC. There are 4 to be exact. The first is a disregarded entity. The second, a partnership, then S Corp and C Corp. Typically for investment properties, we will tax it as a disregarded entity or a partnership. We typically defer to the CPA if the CPA has a way that they really like to tax it. So if you work with a CPA with your rental properties, we will ask, hey, how would you like this to be taxed? And see if they have a preference. But for the most part, we use those 2 for rental properties. For management companies, it may be an S Corp or it may be one of the first 2.
So an LLC is kind of like a chameleon. I mean, the idea here is it's one of our most simple entities that we have. If you called me and said, hey, I've got this property, I'm concerned about what Katie said, I need to protect my personal stuff because I like to have this property, but I have, cash in the bank or other investments and things like that. Almost every attorney you talk to is going to default towards an LLC. There are some states that are a little bit different. There may be some different excise taxes and things like that may make a different structure, I don't know, a little bit more tax efficient, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say 95% of the time, the LLC is our most basic structure. But that's just the legal side. On the tax side, kind of what Katie was saying, they are a chameleon. You've got 4 different options. When we're talking about real estate here, we really, and you're going to have to trust us on this. I promise you're not going to want that tax as an S Corp or a C Corp. I can get into the nitty gritty on that, but we're really looking for either disregarded entity status, where it just passes through to your personal tax return, or there are sometimes and some reasons why we want it to actually file its own return as a partnership. That's more on the tax side of things, and we certainly will defer to your CPA. But if you're setting up an LLC to hold a real estate that's producing income, go ahead and know that we're going to lean towards disregarded entity or partnership. I have seen some clients that have purchased property inside of an S corp before. It happens, especially when we're dealing with, closing gets complicated and we're dealing with the SBA and whatever it is, and it just happens. And now we have a piece of property inside of an S corp. It's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world, and there are ways to get out of that. But we're always going to lean towards those first two. C corps, we're really going to reserve that for a whole nother class of entities. It's not really subject for the matter we're talking about today. So know that one of the questions, if you said, hey, Landon, I need an LLC because you and Katie said it on a webinar, I'm going to say, okay, great. How do you want it taxed? Disregarded entity, if you own it by yourself or potentially with a spouse, or partnership, if you own it with more than one person. And then we're going to send you right back to your CPA, because that's where we want you and me and Katie and your CPA to be all on the same page to figure out what is the best tax situation we can get you guys in. Because half of what we do is the legal side of things. The other half is the tax side. So know that as you're talking through these things with your business partners and with us and your CPAs, there's going to be a lot of tax conversation here that we've got to go through. And that's okay. I mean, that's kind of the whole point, is let's make sure that everybody's on the same page from that perspective. So moving on, why the heck do we even need a LLC? Well, I kind of think of it as there's really two reasons. One is duty. And we say that word, and what does that really mean? As an owner of real estate anywhere in the world, well, let me back up. Anywhere in the United States. I don't know French law or Italian law, but let's focus on the United States here. Anywhere in the United States, if you own a piece of property, you have a duty to the world to make sure that it's safe to be there, which makes sense. If I invited Katie over for a dinner at my house and I said, hey, why don't you guys come over, bring the dogs, let's go have fun. Or, I invited some of my business partners over and I said, bring the kids. It makes sense that my house needs to be safe for them and their families to be there. When we're dealing with rental properties, in most states, they're going to recognize that as more of a commercial property. If you come over to my house and we're just friends and we're just hanging out and we're going to have a cup of coffee or drink a beer or, eat dinner, we're there as friends, which is fine. But if you're staying in my rental property, whether it's a short-term rental or a long-term rental or it's my office, there's a commercial purpose. I want you to stay in that house or go to that property because I want to make money off of you, which is inherently not a bad thing. But the states are going to say, okay, that's fine, but because you're making a profit or you're bringing people onto your property to make money. In a normal situation, people are coming over to your house and they're friends. Your duty is here. They're coming onto your property and you're making money off of them. Your duty is here, or maybe here, or I don't want to stand up here. But it's a very, very high duty. Usually it is the highest duty under state law. So we want to make sure that you're protected and that your other assets are protected, like Katie was saying earlier. The other thing about rental properties that is not true of my home is when we finish up with this webinar here in a second, I'm going to go home and I'm going to chase kids and pick up messes, and I'm going to find out if there's something wrong at my house that needs to be fixed. The problem with a rental property, whether it's a short-term, a long-term rental, or a commercial property, is I'm not going home to that one tonight. I don't know who's staying there tonight. If it's an Airbnb, I got their request on Airbnb and said, yeah, go for it. But I don't know who's there and I don't know what they're doing this evening. And if they tear something up, I'm not there to know that it happened. And so there's a different presence component where if it's something at my house that gets broken and I invite you over for dinner, I'm going to tell you, hey, be careful. Don't go in the backyard. The fence around the pool is down. There's broken glass over there. I actually was just, I was on vacation in Ruidoso, New Mexico, and There's a little winery out there, and it was me and some of our friends. We had a bunch of young kids. They were running around. We were throwing snowballs at each other, and one of the kids walked over and, not even joking, picked up a piece of broken glass, and it was my kid. I'll tell on myself. I have a 1.5-year-old, and she carried over a piece of glass to me, and I'm like, holy cow, well, where did you get that? Well, there's a broken window out there that I'm sure the owners of that winery didn't even know was broken, because it was kind of off in the corner, but my 1.5-year-old was investigating and was able to find it. And so when you're not there all the time, or if, there's a bachelor party that stays at your Airbnb this weekend, and then my apparently investigative 1.5-year-old goes over and finds that piece of broken glass, that responsibility is on you. And I promise you, if my 1.5-year-old cut herself up pretty bad, I'm going to be pretty angry. And so anytime we're dealing with a property that you're not there at regularly or every day, and it's a property that the state puts a high duty on you to maintain, we've got to have some type of protection, which is where the LLC comes into play. When do I set up an LLC? So most states are going to give you a pretty strong homestead exemption on your primary residence. And again, most of the time, the people you invite into your home are there as friends or neighbors or, colleagues or whatever it is. So we're not really looking to put your homestead, your primary residence, in an LLC. We certainly can, but you may lose that homestead exemption. And most states are going to give you that strong homestead exemption that says, hey, if it's your home, you get sued, they can't necessarily take that home from you. Some states may allow that. Some states certainly allow, a creditor or somebody that's suing you to put a lien against that house. But when we're talking LLC land here, we're really talking about income producing properties because of that duty. The other time we're talking about this is when we're owning properties with somebody else. If my wife and I own our home together, no big deal. We have the homestead, it is what it is. But Katie and I own a property together, that triggers a whole set of other issues. I like Katie a lot, she's great, but at the end of the day, if something happens to me and Katie and I own a property together, that brings in a whole nother set of other issues. Like, let's say I get hit by a bus today. Well, default rules, or under my default estate plan, who is Katie's new business partner? Probably going to be my wife, which I like to think that my wife and Katie get along just fine. But I'm willing to bet if Katie, I'm willing to bet that if Katie and I went into business together to buy this piece of property, even though her and I get along great, we can manage this property together great, she may not want to manage that property with my wife. And that's okay. But that brings in a whole nother slew of, what we call buy-sell provisions, where if one of us dies or wants out of the transaction, or if I want to sell my ownership in this property to my best friend Joe or whatever it is, there's a whole nother level of complexity that needs to be taken into consideration. And then Airbnbs and VRBOs, there's just a different level of risk with Airbnbs and VRBOs, at least in my opinion, as compared to other, let's say, long-term rentals. With a long-term rental, you're really worried about, one tenant a year or maybe a couple per year. With an Airbnb, depending on where you're at, you could have a different family or, a different group of friends there every single weekend. And so it goes from, I'm worried about one person to now I'm worried about 100 people that potentially could be litigants against me if there's something wrong with the property. So there's just a different level of risk. And so we tell folks, when you're thinking about setting up an LLC, the appropriate time is when you've got an income producing property. You've got a business partner in one of those. Certainly if it's a short-term rental, it still applies to long-term rentals. Again, it's just a different risk, in my opinion, is what we're kind of looking for there. Katie, talk to us about when you should implement it.
Now, if you don't have one, if you have an income producing property, you should have an LLC as well. So it's not too late. You don't have to set up the LLC before you purchase that property. So you can set it up after you purchase the property, and we can flip it right in. I was actually telling a realtor today that setting up an LLC doesn't have to interrupt the sale of the house. If somebody's buying an investment property, we can set it up, and then once the sale goes through, we can just flip it into the LLC. Again, you have to register it with the state. You have to register it with the IRS, which means pulling a tax ID number, creating an operating agreement. Not everyone can do that. So lawyers create operating agreements. I know I had a conversation with a CPA not too long ago, and he said that CPAs cannot draft operating agreements. And an operating agreement, when I say that, a lot of people go, well, what is that? It's literally an agreement about how your LLC is going to operate. So if you have a manager of your LLC, or you are the manager of your LLC, who are the members, the owners of the LLC, and how you're going to function and be taxed. A lot of banks will require an operating agreement. When you go to set up your bank account, they'll ask you for your articles, they'll ask you for your tax ID, and they'll ask you for that operating agreement. They want to know who owns this LLC and why are you opening a bank account. So that being said, a bank account, you should have a bank account under the name of your LLC if you're setting up an LLC for your investment property. A little bit touching on what Landon had said before, he had mentioned buy-sell agreements, that if one member passes away or becomes disabled or decides to get out entirely, we want to have that in writing about how that all is going to go down, so that there's no disagreement on the back end about who's the member or who takes over the company and how much money is changing hands. So I had someone ask me not too long ago, I downloaded this rental agreement off of the internet. Is it good? The answer is probably not, and I'll tell you why. There are a lot of different kinds of rental agreements. So these three on the screen talk about commercial, residential, short-term. Each one of these has different kinds of rules, and every state is different. So commercial lease agreements, I think there are 3 or 4 different kinds of commercial lease agreements. Residential lease agreements, there's long-term and short-term, but each has different rules about security deposits and how much you can require in a security deposit and when you have to give it back. So there are a lot of different rules for every state, and we want to make sure that we kind of tailor that agreement to you and your properties. So if you have 6 rental properties and one of them has a pool and the other one has a fire pit and one of them has a really dangerous staircase, we want to make sure that we're mentioning those things in the lease agreement and saying, you know what, you're using that at your own risk, or at least addressing the risk to some extent. So we kind of tailor those lease agreements to the client or what they have on their property.
I was in, now, hear me say this loud and clear, I don't do evictions, okay? But I did do one a long time ago. It was a long time ago, but I was sitting there in eviction court, and the judge came out and he said to everybody, and it was all that was happening that day was evictions. And the judge came out and he said, listen, guys, I know this has been a rule in the state I was practicing in for a long time. It's never really been enforced until today, but I'm telling you now, if you don't keep your security deposits separate from your operating account, anybody you try to evict, I'm just going to throw the case out until you can show me you've separated your security deposit from your operating expenses. And I saw about 10 people just stand up and walk out of the courtroom. And that was a weird state law that not every state has, but a lot of them do. And so there's so many state law nuances that we've got to watch out for. So keep that in mind with rental agreements. It's not a one size fits all, especially when you're talking between the differences between types of leases. So be careful with those state law forms. You may get your eviction case kicked out of court and have to restart the whole process, which isn't fun for anybody. We wanted to spend a little bit of time on intellectual property, which is a really big topic, but this has come up a whole lot, especially in the more recent years. This didn't used to be as big of a deal, but it's been a big thing that we've seen happen over and over again. And so I want to spend some time talking about trade names, trademarks, and copyrights, and how that can play a role in what you all are trying to do with your rental property companies. So let's start with trademarks. Almost every state has, we're going to start with trade names. How about that? Every state, for the most part, allows you to file a trade name for your entity. So a lot of times we do this more for branding purposes. I may have long family properties, which may not sound like any fun at all to come stay at. And when I list my property on VRBO, who wants to come stay at long family properties? But, and Katie created this slide. If you want to come stay at Rental Palooza, that may be a whole lot more fun for you. And so a lot of times what we'll do is we'll do a more generic property holding company name, but as a part of your branding, we may want to have it, each property or each cabin or each short-term rental, to have its own, it's called a brand. And so we can always file these, well, you'll hear it called a DBA sometimes. Each state's a little bit different on what they call it, but we can give a little bit of a brand to your entity. And you could have one entity that has multiple brands. And we'll get into this a little bit with series LLCs in a second, but it may not provide exclusive rights to the name. That's more of a trademark thing, which I'm going to talk about next. But it does allow you to accept checks. If I'm trying to stay at Rental Palooza, I may not know that it's owned by MacKenzie Properties, and I may make my check out to Rental Palooza, but Katie could go take that check to the bank, and the bank is going to say, "Oh, great, you got a DBA on file for Rental Palooza. We'll go ahead and deposit that now." If I make it out to Rental Palooza, because that's what you branded your property as, and we don't have that on file, the bank could say, "Wait, we need this person to go remake this check out to MacKenzie Properties because we don't know who this is." And so that can cause some delays, and you got to go track down that person and things like that. So really helpful if you're more into the branding side of things, which is becoming a growing area. Trademarks are where we get some actual intellectual property protection. Now, there's two different flavors of this. There's state level trademarks, and then there's federal trademarks. So, Evans and Davis, we have federally trademarked our name. So if anybody tries to open up a law firm doing the type of law that we do in any other states, and maybe Guam and Puerto Rico, I don't know, we could go in and send them a cease and desist and say, "Hey, you've got to shut that down because we've got this federally trademarked in all 50 states and US territories." Most of the time, that's not going to apply to a rental property company because you don't really need protection. A Rental Palooza in Texas is probably not going to do a lot of harm to the financial interest of a Rental Palooza in Florida. Federal trademarks are really expensive. They take, right now, I've got some that I've been working on for over a year that haven't been processed yet. So I have a lot of folks that say, "I don't want to wait that long. I don't want to pay that much money, but I do want to make sure that nobody can open, or set up a cabin or set up a rental property with this same name within my state." Well, then we can look to state level trademark protection. Typically, it's a little bit cheaper. Typically doesn't take as long. Now, there are some states that are, their processing times take a while. I'm not looking at you, Texas, but I'm looking at you, where their processing times are a little bit different. But what you don't want to do is have some creative name that ties to the character of your cabin or your rental property, and then somebody comes in and says, "I'm going to be Rental Palooza 2.0, or I'm going to be Palooza Rental Properties." That can be a problem because now we've got people that are more or less trying to piggyback off of what you've created. So it does give us the exclusive right to use that name, that identity. You can also do logos. It's getting way more popular now, where we've got folks that are saying, "Well, I created this cute little logo that I want to trademark too," and we can do that a lot of times as well. Copyrights sounds kind of funky, but I've got a lot of clients that are looking to, when they own the floor plan or there's something unique about the property or the architecture that they created with an architect, we've got to protect that. I've had clients before that their house looks like this, and a few miles away, one popped up looking almost identically. And so there are some what we call common law rights where You can enforce them without having something filed, but I will promise you, if you got something filed that is your federal copy, and this is a federal thing, this copyright deal. If there's something filed that says, I own this floor plan, if somebody comes in and gets something pretty similar and we can prove it, it's a whole lot easier to shut them down. Now, if you're just doing, if you don't own the rights, if the architect owns the rights, we can't do this, obviously. Or if it's more of a spec home or something like that, I'm less concerned. But if you've invested your time, money, and resources into this, it's worth spending a few $100 or $1,000 to protect it. And we do that a lot of times with the copyright. Katie, talk to us about transferring title.
So in order to, when you set up an LLC to actually protect the property as a property holding company, you have to put the property inside of the LLC. So if the LLC is our bucket, we're deeding the property into that bucket to give it that protection, that bubble of protection. We want to make sure that that deed is executed correctly. Each state has different requirements on how deeds have to be executed. But that is the main part, is putting that property actually into the LLC. Now, if that's not an option, which some clients don't want to put their property into their LLC, and it's preferred, but if you don't want to do that, then we can set up a management company and we don't have to deed the property into the LLC, and the management company will manage that property. But that's specific to the client situation. I wanted to touch a little bit on banking issues. So I'm going to kind of switch courses. We want to make sure that that LLC, the profits and what you're expending through the LLC is going through a business bank account. And I touched on it before a little bit, but I have encountered a lot of people in my time that will set up an LLC and they'll have their rental properties and they'll never deed the rental properties into the LLC, and they'll never set up a bank account, and they'll run everything through their personal bank account and think, well, I have an LLC, I'm okay. And if your property's not in your LLC and all of the money from your property is in a bank account in your personal name, you're not. So we want to make sure that's all set up correctly. Landon, I think you were going to talk a little bit about the due on sale clause. Did you want to touch on that?
Yeah. So, I haven't seen many mortgages that my clients just don't send those to me when we set up these LLCs, because I more or less know what they say. Most mortgages are going to say a couple things that you need to be aware of, and I'm gonna tell you the rule, and then I'm going to tell you what I've seen in reality. So what is most common for my clients is that they will go and get the best deal from the bank on these rental properties. And so those come in two flavors. A lot of times it's a client's primary residence that they used to live in, and then they've bought a new one and they're renting out the old one. A lot of people do that. The other situation that I see is clients will find, especially in the short-term rental world, is a client will finance a Airbnb or VRBO property as a vacation home or second home. Now, two things you need to be aware of in both of those mortgages. And if you Google rental properties and things like that, you're going to see due on sale clause pop up. And here's what that says. It says, if you transfer, well, let's back up. It says, if you sell this property, the bank gets paid back first, which makes sense. If I buy a piece of property, I sell it to Katie, the bank should get paid back first before I can take any proceeds. Now, there's not an exception. If I own a property 100% and I transfer it to an LLC that I own 100%, there's not an exception to that due on sale clause. The bank could look at that and say, Landon sold that property. Well, I didn't sell it. It's me on one end, me on the other. And especially when you finance something as a second home or a vacation home, typically they're going to limit the number of nights that you can rent that property out. Usually it's 12 nights, sometimes it's 20. Each bank's a little bit different, but those two clauses are in there. Well, what happens is when you put that property in an LLC or you rent it out for more than 12 nights a year, you are in immediate breach of your mortgage. That's the rule. Now, from a reality standpoint, I'll tell you this. Most of my clients, I tell them, the risk there is that the bank calls your note due. And so they will call your note due, they'll accelerate it, which usually means you have to refinance. They have that right. Now, I haven't seen them do that before. And Katie and I have 24 attorneys that work in our firm, all over the country. And about once a year, every couple of years, I ask folks, has anybody seen a bank do this in the wild? I haven't seen it happen. Now, if you go online, you're going to see that, there's a lot of concern about that. And I get it. But what I tell folks is know that that risk is there. And from my perspective, if the property's in an LLC versus not, and there's a lawsuit, who's more protected in that situation? Usually the client and ultimately the bank. If you get sued and you own that property personally, they can come after you and all your other assets. So the likelihood the bank gets paid back is relatively slim. Now, that's a risk that has to be evaluated with every single LLC, every single client, and we need to talk through those specifics because your mortgage may be very different from what I expect to see. But if you leave this webinar and you say, gosh, I need an LLC, and you hop on Google, you're going to see this pop up. It's everywhere. So know that it's a risk that we need to evaluate, assess on an individual level. So take that and know that we'll discuss that in any conversation that we have related to these properties and the LLCs.
I was just going to jump back in to say that insurance coverage is also really important on two different levels. First, if you have set up an LLC, that insurance should either be under the LLC for your insurance policy for your investment property, or the LLC should be an additional insured on that policy. So it's important to get with your insurance agent and say, hey, look, I transferred into this into my LLC. What do I need to do with my insurance, and see how they want to structure it. The second point I wanted to make about insurance is I've had people ask me, hey, Katie, I have an umbrella policy. Is that good? Do I actually need an LLC? And the answer to that is yes, you still need an LLC. So umbrella policies are amazing. I have one myself. I love umbrella policies. Do they always pay out? So no, all insurance companies and all policies have exceptions. So we want to make sure that your personal assets are safe if that policy doesn't pay out. And if you want to have an umbrella policy over your LLC, perfect, amazing. We love it.
And the insurance is great. And I'm 1000% on the same page with Katie, but not everything's insurable too. You've got a long-term tenant that you wrongfully evict. There may not be insurance for that. And so having the LLC there to protect your other assets is pretty critical from that perspective as well.
That's accurate.
All right, Katie, tell us about practicing having properties in multiple states.
So every state is different. And I'll say this and I'll say it again, and I'll say it a million times more. Every state has different state statutes. So when you're setting up an LLC in Oklahoma, it's going to be way different from setting up an LLC in New York. So there are different requirements as far as operating agreements go. There are different requirements as far as what you have to file annually or biannually with the state. So some states will require you to file an annual report every year and pay the state to keep your LLC active. And some only require it every other year, and the fees differ wildly. The operating agreements, some states require you to file them with the state after you've created your LLC. So the different state rules are all over the board. We want to make sure that you're following those statutory rules for your LLC. And to shift gears just a little bit, we were going to touch on adequate liability protection and overloading your LLC. And I swear it's on the same topic. So if you have if you have 5 properties, so say I have 5 investment properties, and you say, well, Katie, I have an LLC, I set it up 5 years ago, it's still active. Can I just deed all of the properties into my LLC? You shouldn't. And the reason being is that if you have too many properties in your LLC and somebody comes to sue you, we don't want them to be able to collect all like a game of Monopoly. We want them to only be able to come after one property. So there are a couple of different tools for that. And Landon, I think you were going to talk a little about series LLCs next. So I'll put that off for a little bit, but you can create in certain states extra LLCs. You can have 4 different LLCs and deed each property into those LLCs. But the filing fees you're going to have to keep up with for every LLC. So I think is series LLCs next.
Yeah. And it's weird that you use New York as an example when New Jersey is where you're from. Is there some beef there or what's going on there, huh?
New York just has weird rules. I don't know. We're not the same.
So Katie's right. You know, the idea with these LLCs is that we are trying to limit our exposure, certainly from our personal assets, but also from the assets of if multiple properties. You know, you've got one entity that has 5 properties in it. Something happens against property A, if it's just a normal entity, they could come after properties B, C, and D. We don't want that to happen. So what we've got to do is we've got to evaluate this from a state by state perspective. Now, my knee-jerk reaction is if I've got a client that says, I've got these 5 properties, I'm immediately going to ask them, what state are they in? Because there's about 20 states that recognize this series LLC. These are relatively new creations in the what word am I looking for in the grand scheme? How about that? Of corporate law or LLC law. They've only been around since the 80s, but they're fantastic for holding rental properties because instead of doing one LLC per property, which is no fun for anybody because you've got to have 5 bank accounts, 5 tax IDs, file 5 annual renewals every year. If your properties are in a state that recognize series LLC, we're able to put all of them in one entity. But internally, I've organized that in a way where, let's say, you see my little chart over there. Series A only owns 1 property. Series B owns property B. Series C owns property C. And if it's set up correctly and you're running it correctly, which I'll touch on that in a second, in theory, the assets and liabilities of Series A are separate and apart from Series B and C and D. Now, not every state allows this. So, you know, I have some properties in Oklahoma, which is great. Got a series for that. But an opportunity came across my desk to look at something in Florida. Well, Florida says, nope, we're not doing that. We don't have those yet. Now, pure speculation, give the states 20 years. I suspect every state will have these, but right now they just don't. So in Florida, we had to go set up a standalone entity to hold that property. But if you live in a state that recognizes these, they're fantastic. Now the rules are always going to be a little bit different, but they're ideal for owning multiple properties here. If you don't have properties in a state that allow that, we need to evaluate it on a cost benefit analysis. You know, if I've got a client in California that has 4 properties, the safest thing to do is do 4 separate LLCs, but every LLC in California requires that you pay $800 a year minimum in franchise taxes. So their annual costs just went to $3,200 a year, which a lot of times is not ideal. Probably not a lot of times, it's never ideal. So we need to figure out a way to balance the costs and the benefits of that. But if it's in a state that allows these, or there are some states that don't have the specific statute for it, but they have statute that say we will recognize them if they were organized in a state that permits these, then we're good. But we've got to do that on a case-by-case basis to make sure you guys are completely protected there. Administration, this applies to LLCs and series, and this is the point I wanted to get to a second ago. You've got to have separate books and records. Most state statutes say you've got to have separate books and records for your LLC. With respect to the series LLC, most states say you've got to have separate books and records for each series. Your operating agreement is going to establish that, especially with series LLCs. We're going to talk about that inside your operating agreement. How do we keep track of the income and the losses and the depreciation and all that? Bank accounts, you really have got to have a separate bank account for your LLC. If you have a series LLC, depending on the state, not every state requires you to have a separate bank account. Is that best practices? Probably yes, but you don't have to in every single state. It really comes down to the bookkeeping. You've got to have some kind of system that if you get sued on Tuesday, you can show the income and the expenses from each LLC or each series are separate and apart from my personal finances. You start commingling assets, that's a problem. Now, let's say you've got a very successful Airbnb and you've got $20,000 in that account that you don't need to maintain that property. You want to pull that money out and take your kids to Disney. Great. Move that money from your LLC account to your personal account and then pay for Disney. Don't pay for Disney out of your LLC account. What you're doing is you're commingling funds and you're eroding that corporate veil that the states permit you to have. They only permit you to have that corporate veil if you follow the rules. One of the rules is don't commingle funds. So make sure you're doing that. And your CPAs are going to be a big help in that. And they'll do a lot of the tracking on that. But if you're not going to use your CPA, set up a QuickBooks or a spreadsheet or something. Again, use separate bank accounts, please. That's the easiest way to do it. But you got to have something internally for sure. All right.
So we're going to talk a little bit about piercing the corporate veil and funding your LLC with adequate capital. Landon, I think you talked about it just a little bit, but if you're setting up an LLC, you have to put something in the LLC. If somebody were to sue your LLC and it had nothing in it, they can do what's called piercing the corporate veil. So the judge will say, you know what, there was really nothing in that LLC. It was actually just you. The same thing will happen if you commingle assets. So we want to make sure, again, what Landon said, everything's books and records are all in order. You're following the statutory requirements for your state to keep your LLC alive.
The most common situation a veil gets pierced is when an LLC is undercapitalized, meaning your property's not in it and your insurance isn't a named insured. That's probably the most common situations we see where the LLC, the judge says, it says the right things, but it's not doing the right things. And so getting the assets in there, getting the insurance added as an additional insured is very key.
Yeah. And using LegalZoom, downloading rental agreements or having them help you set up your LLC and having an operating agreement through LegalZoom. I don't knock the fact that people tried to set up an LLC, but sometimes we see those agreements and they are not as protective as we would like them to be. So we want to make sure that we're not using online tools. It's kind of like using online tools to file complicated tax returns. So we try not to do that.
I'm about to share my favorite slide of this whole presentation, and we don't need to read it to you, but Katie and I, this was some time ago, we took these quotes and copied and pasted them from the terms and conditions on LegalZoom's website. And if Katie, you want to hit on a couple of these, but more than anything, just read some of these. And you know, LegalZoom, I get it. You know, they provide a service, but you've got to know what you're signing up for. And this is terrifying to me, to be completely honest.
It's like, we're not a lawyer. We're not giving legal advice. We can't guarantee everything's completely current. State law changes a lot. So there's a lot of points in those terms and conditions that you should read before paying for that service.
You should consult a licensed attorney in your area.
Yeah.
I get it. I get that cutting costs is really important. I mean, I'm a business owner too. I completely get it. This is not where you're going to want to cut costs using a service like this. A couple more points, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. We've had a lot of good questions come in that we want to be sure that we get to. And if we don't get to your question, then certainly we will feel free to email it to us and we'll address it. But an LLC is you know, absolutely critical to getting your assets protected. But other things that we want to think about is making sure that, okay, I've got myself protected here. this property is protected, but what about all my other stuff? What about my retirement and my life insurance and my savings account and my primary residence? If something happens to me, where does the other rest of this stuff go? I get that the LLC protects me here, but what about my kids? What about my family? What about my father-in-law that I'm, helping out? And so know that a lot of the conversation that I have with folks is, hey, we've got to get your LLC done because you've got a lot of liability there. Let's focus on that first. Let's knock that out. But know that Katie and I and our firm is going to push you guys and to try to transition you into a bigger conversation about what we call estate planning and what does that look like. And so know that there's a whole lot of other stuff that goes into this to make sure that you guys are all protected all the way around, not just your LLC. When we talk about LLCs, real estate, rental properties, we get this question a lot. Well, I've heard that I need a trust. Yeah, you probably do, especially if you've got property in multiple states and things like that. What we're trying to do is make sure that if something happens to you, your property doesn't get stuck in probate, which that's where if you don't have a formal trust-based estate plan in most states, something happens to you, we've got to send that LLC or that property to probate court where we may spend 6 months, 9 months, or a year just getting it from you to your spouse or to your kids. And that's expensive. It's very public. It takes a lot of time. And ultimately, I've got young kids. I told you about my 1-year-old, but I got a 4-year-old too, that I want to make sure that this stuff that I'm building and I'm trying to create ultimately goes to them. And so know that that's kind of phase 2 of this conversation for a lot of our clients. Just don't forget to think about that side too. And I know we're all busy and we get caught up in life. And we focus on one issue, but it's hard to sometimes zoom out and see the forest because we're stuck in the trees. So know that there's maybe a second level of planning here for us to cover. And then just as a reminder to you guys, and I know a lot of you all have worked with us before, but we do a lot of obviously LLC planning and asset protection, but we do estate planning, trust administration, probates when we have to, and things like that. So if you ever have any questions about any of this stuff, you guys are welcome to reach out to Katie or myself, and we'd love to help you. At this time, we're going to turn it over to Q&A. And if you all have questions, we've got a few through the chat here that we'll address. And then if we don't answer your question, we want to be cognizant of your time. So we'll probably spend 5 or 10 minutes here, but know that you can email those to us after this.
Katie, Landon, we got a question about what the process is when someone does want to set up an LLC. Maybe they're watching this and they realize this is something they need. What would that look like? And what are their first steps as far as getting that process started?
Katie, take it.
Call a lawyer. I'm not kidding, but the first step would be to, one, let the attorney know what property you want to put into your LLC. But the basic steps of setting up an LLC are, again, file it with the state, make sure you have that EIN letter, make sure that you have an operating agreement, which is an agreement about how the members and the managers operate the LLC, and make sure that you're setting up a business bank account for all of the money to flow through, and then deeding that property into the LLC. So we want to make sure the property goes in the bucket.
We got a question on short-term rental agreements and just kind of the best way to implement those. I know Airbnb and VRBO have, their click the box. I just booked an Airbnb for my family in Galveston this summer. We're going to take the kids down there and let them run around on the beach and, probably deal with the massive seaweed that's headed that way. When I clicked the box on VRBO, I said, yes, I agree. I don't know anything about the condition of the property, but I can't hold the owners responsible. To some extent, is that enforceable? Potentially. But when we're talking about short-term rental agreements, from my perspective, that's just to click the box. It's very generic to any property that's out there on Airbnb and VRBO. So a lot of times we like to have your own rental agreement. And if you manage the properties yourself, it's a little bit easier to incorporate, but I stayed at an Airbnb, I don't know, a few years ago, in California, and they had all the rental agreements printed and on the table. And they literally said, if you don't sign that agreement within an hour of being there, they reserve the right to come kick you out. And me as the lawyer, of course, I didn't read a word, but I knew that if I signed that agreement or if I didn't within the hour, I'm going to get kicked out. And I truly think that a wet ink signature on that agreement is a whole heck of a lot more enforceable than a click the box. And so there may be some logistics there that you've got to deal with, figuring out how to get it signed, how to get it sent back to you. I think what we did is we just signed it, and our friend that booked the place took a picture of everybody's signature and texted it to the property manager. That click the box may protect you, but I'm a big fan of getting that wet ink signature on there and getting that in your hands so that there's a problem. One, it's tailored to that property, but two, it's not a click the box. Like you don't read the terms and conditions when Apple sends you an update on your software. It's kind of the same thing. Like, I should have read the whole thing. Did I? No. But now if I try to enforce that against them, they can say, Landon, you should have read that and you didn't. You signed it anyways. So you waived your rights. I don't have the stats on that, to be completely honest, but I do encourage my clients to take that extra step there. All right, let's see what other questions we have here.
Actually, I wanted to touch on something before we sign off, and I'm sorry if I'm mixing somebody's question. I've gotten this question 3 times in the last week or so I think it's important to kind of hop on it and get ahead of it. If you've got your actual homestead, your house that you live in is on the same lot as your rental property, we do not want to deed that into an LLC as one piece. And I think Landon touched on this a little bit earlier. It's because you'll lose your homestead exemption. And your homestead exemption is basically a tax benefit that you get for living in your house as of January 1st in most states. But we want to make sure those properties are severed before we transfer that rental property into the LLC. I've run into a couple situations where either clients or people I've talked to out in the wild are saying, I'm deeding my property into my LLC. And I'm like, well, is there anything else on that property? So you kind of have to coax it out of them. If you have your property in that situation, make sure that if you set up an LLC, you tell whoever's setting it up, or if you're doing it yourself, just know that homestead should not be in your LLC.
I got another question here. So if I own a property in one state that's in an LLC already, what do I need to do to get another property into it that's owned in another state? And from my perspective, it's really pretty simple. We're going to need to physically deed that property into it, but here's the critical piece. You've got to get that LLC registered in the state that you own the second property in. So we run into this a lot in Oklahoma and Texas, where I've got a client that owns a property in Oklahoma and they buy a property in Texas. We can use the same LLC. Now, ideally we use a series LLC, but if I just deed the Texas property to the Oklahoma LLC and I don't do anything else, there's a lawsuit against the Texas LLC, or I'm sorry, the Texas property. If that Oklahoma LLC is not registered to do business in Texas, it technically and legally cannot defend a lawsuit. So if there's a lawsuit in Texas, there's a very finite amount of time, usually about 20 days. Now, every state's a little bit different, but in that 20 days, not only are we trying to get geared up to defend a lawsuit, but we can't defend that lawsuit until your LLC is registered in that state. Right now, Texas is taking 10 to 14 days to process a state registration. And so the whole time we're like, oh my gosh, are we going to get this registration done in time? Because if we can't, then that entity can't defend a lawsuit in Texas. So if you got property in multiple states, your LLC has to be registered in the state that it owns property in. Otherwise, you can't legally defend a lawsuit. And that leads to a lot of what we call a default judgment, where the judge says, sorry, you weren't properly doing business here. So we're just going to go and give this person everything they wanted. So that it kind of goes back to that multi-state practice that Katie was talking about. Just make sure that if you have property in a state, you got an LLC registered in that state that can actually act and defend that lawsuit.
Great information, Landon, Katie. This has been super informational and I think answered a lot of people's questions. Thank you both. A reminder to all of you watching, we are recording this and we will share the recording. You're welcome to send that on to friends, family, clients, whoever you think would benefit from it. And if there were questions that you had that maybe didn't quite get answered tonight, feel free to send Landon and Katie an email and just let us know if we can do anything to help you. Again, thank you so much for joining us.